Rochester Cathedral, formerly the Cathedral Church of Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary, is an English church of Norman architecture in Rochester, Medway. The church is the cathedral of the Diocese of Rochester in the Church of England and the seat of the Bishop of Rochester, the second oldest bishopric in England after that of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The edifice is a Grade I listed building. History: Anglo-Saxon establishment. The Rochester Diocese was founded by Justice, one of the missionaries who accompanied Augustine of Canterbury to convert the pagan southern English to Christianity in the early 7th century. As the first Bishop of Rochester, Justice was granted permission by King Ethelbert of Kent to establish a church dedicated to Andrew the Apostle on the site of the present cathedral, which was made the seat of a bishopric. The cathedral was to be served by a college of secular priests and was endowed with land near the city called Priestfields. Under the Roman system, a bishop was required to establish a school for the training of priests. To provide the upper parts for music in the services, a choir school was required. Together these formed the genesis of the cathedral school, which today is represented by the King's School, Rochester. The quality of chorister training was praised by Bede. The original cathedral was 42 feet high and 28 feet wide. The apse is marked in the current cathedral on the floor, and sets outside show the line of the walls. Credit for the construction of the building goes to King Ethelbert rather than St. Justice. Bede describes St. Paulinus's burial as in the sanctuary of the blessed Apostle Andrew, which King Ethelbert founded. Likewise he built the city of Rochester. King Ethelbert died in 617 and his successor, Eadbald of Kent, was not a Christian. Justice fled to Francia and remained there for a year before he was recalled by the king. In 644, Ithamar, the first English-born bishop, was consecrated at the cathedral. Ithamar consecrated Erstad as the first Saxon Archbishop of Canterbury on the 26th of March 655. The cathedral suffered much from the ravaging of Kent by King Ethelred of Mercia in 676. So great was the damage that Bishop Putter retired from the diocese and his appointed successor, Cuchelm, gave up the see because of its poverty. In 762, the local overlord, Sigurd, granted land to the bishop, as did his successor Egbert. The charter is notable as it is confirmed by offer of Mercia as overlord of the local kingdom. Following the invasion of 1066, William the Conqueror granted the cathedral and its estates to his half-brother Otto of Bayeux. Bishop Otto misappropriated the resources and reduced the cathedral to near destitution. The building itself was ancient and decayed. During the episcopate of Seawood it was served by 4 or 5 canons living in squalor and poverty. One of the canons became vicar of Chatham and raised sufficient money to make a gift to the cathedral for the soul and burial of his wife, Godgifu. Medieval Priory Gundulph's Church, Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, amongst others, brought Odo to account at the trial of Pennand and Heath c. 1072. Following Odo's final fall, Gundulph was appointed as the first Norman Bishop of Rochester in 1077. The cathedral and its lands were restored to the bishop. Gundulph's first undertaking in the construction of the new cathedral seems to have been the construction of the tower which today bears his name. In about 1080 he began construction of a new cathedral to replace Justice's church. He was a talented architect who probably played a major part in the design of the works he commissioned. The original cathedral had a presbytery of 6 bays with aisles of the same length. The 4 easternmost bays stood over an undercroft which forms part of the present crypt. To the east was a small projection, probably for the silver shrine of Paulinus, which was translated from the old cathedral. The transepts were 120 feet long, but only 14 feet wide. With such narrow transepts, it is thought that the eastern arches of the nave abutted the choir arch. To the south another tower was built. There was no crossing tower. The nave was not completed at first, apparently designed to be 9 bays long, most of the south side, but only 5 bays to the north were completed by Gundulf. The choir was required by the priory, and the south wall formed part of its buildings. It has been speculated that Gundulf simply left the citizens to complete the parochial part of the building. Gundulf did not stop with the fabric. He also replaced the secular chaplains with Benedictine monks, obtained several royal grants of land, and proved a great benefactor to his cathedral city. In 1078, Gundulf founded St. Bartholomew's Hospital just outside the city of Rochester. The Priory of St. Andrew contributed daily and weekly provisions to the hospital, which also received the offerings from the 2 altars of St. James and of St. Giles. During the episcopates of Ernulf and John I, the cathedral was completed. The choir was rearranged, the nave partly rebuilt. Gundulf's nave piers were cased and the west end built. Ernulf is also credited with building the refectory, dormitory and chapter house, only portions of which remain. Finally, Bishop John translated the body of Ithamar from the Old Saxon cathedral to the New Norman one, the whole being dedicated in 1130 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, assisted by 13 bishops in the presence of Henry I. But the occasion was marred by a great fire which nearly destroyed the whole city and damaged the new cathedral. It was badly damaged by fires again in 1137 and 1179. One or other of these fires was sufficiently severe to badly damage or destroy the eastern arm and the transepts. Bishop Ernulf's monastic buildings were also damaged. Medieval remodeling, probably from about 1190. Gilbert de Glanville commenced the rebuilding of the east end and the replacement on the monastic buildings. The north choir transept may have been sufficiently advanced to allow the burial of St. William of Perth in 1201. Alternatively, the coffin may have lain in the north choir aisle until the transept was ready. It was then looted in 1215 by the forces of King John during siege of Rochester Castle. Edmund de Hadnim recounts that there was not a pyx left, in which the body of the Lord might rest upon the altar. However, by 1227, the choir was again in use when the monks made the solemn entry into it. The cathedral was rededicated in 1240 by Bishop Richard Wendine, who had been translated from Bangor. The shrines of S's Paulinus and William of Perth, along with the relics of St. Ithamar, drew pilgrims to the cathedral. Their offerings were so great that both the work mentioned above and the ensuing work could be funded. Unlike the abbeys of the period, the monastic cathedrals were priories ruled over by a prior with further support from the bishop. Rochester and Carlisle were unusual in securing the promotion of a number of monks to be bishops. 7 bishops of Rochester were originally regular monks between 1215 and the dissolution. A consequence of the monastic attachment was a lack of patronage at the bishop's disposal. By the early 16th century, only 4% of the bishop's patronage came from non-parochial sources. The bishop was therefore chronically limited in funds to spend on the non-monastic part of the cathedral. The next phase of the development was begun by Richard de Eastgate, the sacrist. The 2 eastern bays of the nave were cleared and the 4 large piers to support the tower were built. The north nave transept was then constructed. The work was nearly completed by Thomas de Mepham, who became sacrist in 1255. Not long after the south transept was completed and the two bays of the nave nearest the crossing rebuilt to the current form. The intention seems to have been to rebuild the whole nave, but probably lack of funds saved the late Norman work. The cathedral was desecrated in 1264 by the troops of Simon de Montfort during sieges of the city and castle. It is recorded that armed knights rode into the church and dragged away some refugees. Gold and silver were stolen and documents destroyed. Some of the monastic buildings were turned into stables. Just over a year later, de Montfort fell at the Battle of Evesham to the forces of King Edward.The. Later, in 1300, Edward passed through Rochester on his way to Canterbury and is recorded as having given 7 shillings at the shrine of St. William, and the same again the following day. During his return he again visited the cathedral and gave a further 7 shillings at each of the shrines of Ss. Paulinus and of the Mar. The new century saw the completion of the new decorated work with the original Norman architecture, the rebuilding of the nave being finally abandoned. Around 1320 the south transept was altered to accommodate the altar of the Virgin Mary. There appears to have been a rood screen thrown between the two western piers of the crossing. A rood loft may have surmounted it. Against this screen was placed the altar of St. Nicholas, the parochial altar of the city. The citizens demanded the right of entrance by day and night to what was after all their altar. There were also crowds of strangers passing through the city. The friction broke out as a riot in 1327, after which the strong stone screens and doors which wall off the eastern end of the church from the nave were built. The priory itself was walled off from the town at this period. An oratory was established in Angulo Navis from the reserved sacrament. It is not clear to which Angulo was being referred, but Dr. Palmer argues that the buttress against the northwest tower pier is the most likely setting. He notes the arch filled in with rubble on the aisle side, and on nave side there is a scar line with lower quality stonework below. The buttress is about 4 feet thick, enough for an oratory. Palmer notes that provision for reservation of consecrated hosts was often made to the north of the altar, which would be the case here. The central tower was at last raised by Bishop Hamada Hyde in 1343, thus essentially completing the cathedral. Bells were placed in the central tower. The chapter room doorway was constructed at around this time. The Black Death struck England in 1347–49. From then on there were probably considerably more than 20 monks in the priory. Later medieval history. The modern paintwork of the choir walls is modelled on artwork from the Middle Ages. Sir Gilbert Scott found remains of painting behind the wooden stalls during his restoration work in the 1870s. The painting is therefore part original and part authentic. The alternate lions and fleurs de lis reflect Edward III's victories and assumed sovereignty over the French. In 1356 the Black Prince had defeated John II of France at Poitiers and took him prisoner. On the 2nd of July 1360 John passed through Rochester on his way home and made an offering of 60 crowns at the Church of St. Andrew. The oratory provided for the citizens of Rochester did not settle the differences between the monks and the city. The eventual solution was the construction of St. Nicholas Church by the north side of the cathedral. A doorway was knocked through the western end of the north aisle to allow processions to pass along the north aisle of the cathedral before leaving by the west door. In the mid-15th century the clerestory vaulting of the north choir aisle was completed and new perpendicular period windows inserted into the Navils. Possible preparatory work for this is indicated in 1410–11 by the bridge wardens of Rochester, who recorded a gift of lead from the Lord Prior. The lead was sold on for 41 shillings. In 1470 the great west window at the cathedral was completed, and finally, in around 1490, what is now the Lady Chapel was built. Rochester Cathedral, although one of England's smaller cathedrals, thus demonstrates all styles of Romanesque and Gothic architecture. In 1504 John Fisher was appointed Bishop of Rochester. Although Rochester was by then an impoverished see, Fisher elected to remain as bishop for the remainder of his life. He had been tutor to the young Prince Henry, and on the prince's accession as King Henry.The, Fisher remained his staunch supporter and mentor. He figured in the anti-Lutheran policies of Henry right up until the divorce issue and split from Rome in the early 1530s. Fisher remained true to Roman for his defensive. The Pope was elevated as a cardinal in May 1535. King Henry was angered by these moves, and, on the 22nd of June 1535, Cardinal Fisher was beheaded on Tower Green. Henry.The visited Rochester on the 1st of January 1540 when he met Anne of Cleves for the first time and was greatly disappointed. Whether connected or not, the old priory of St Andrew was dissolved by royal command later in the year, one of the last monasteries to be dissolved. Modern foundation Henrician settlement. The post-dissolution foundation was a dean, 6 prebendaries, 6 minor canons, a deacon, a subdeacon, 6 lay clerks, a master of the choristers, 8 choristers, an upper and an under master of the grammar school, 20 scholars, 6 poor men, a porter, a butler, chief cook and assistant. 4 scholars were supported. The deacon and subdeacon disappeared during the English Reformation. The butler and cooks went when there was no longer a common board. Nicholas Ridley was consecrated Bishop of Rochester in 1547 during the reign of Edward VI. During his time at Rochester he directed that the altars in the churches of his diocese should be removed and tables put in the place to celebrate the Lord's Supper. In 1548 he helped Thomas Cranmer compile the Book of Common Prayer, and in 1549 he was one of the commissioners who investigated Bishops Stephen Gardiner and Edmund Bonner and agreed that they should be removed from office. In 1550 he was translated to London. 3 years later Ridley was involved in the plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne in preference to the Roman Catholic Queen Mary. The plot failed and Ridley paid the price. He was burnt at the stake for treason on the 16th of October 1555. The cathedral suffered a steep decline after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, during which time its estates were confiscated by the crown, and it became dilapidated and fell into disrepute. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, would later dismiss it as a shabby place. Rochester's location beside Watling Street did, however, mean that there continued to be a string of notable visitors. Most famously, Queen Elizabeth I stayed in Rochester for 4 days in 1573, attending divine service in the cathedral on the 19th of September. In 1606 James I and his brother-in-law, Christian IV of Denmark, visited the city, accompanied by his family. King James was accommodated at the bishop's palace and the whole party attended a Sunday service led by Bishop Barlow. Archbishop Laud visited the cathedral in 1633 and complained about its general state, in particular that it suffered much for want of glass in the windows. By the following year the defects had been mainly remedied, the excuse being that the backlog had built up due to money being spent on making of the organ. remains. Laud accepted this and required completion, noting among other items that the bells and the frame needed to be put into good order. In 1635 the cathedral was described as small and plain, yet it is very lightsome and pleasant. Her choir is neatly adorned with many small pillars of marble. Her organs, though small, yet are they rich and neat. Her quiristers, though but few, yet orderly and decent. The author then describes the various monuments, divers others also of antiquity, so dismembered, defaced and abused. The reference to the monuments is particularly relevant, for this was 6 years before the despoliation of the cathedral by parliamentarian soldiers in the wake of the English Civil War. In 1641 Sir John Evelyn paid his first visit to the cathedral as recorded in his diary. The 19th we rode to Rochester, and having seen the cathedral, Civil War, the official record runs. On Wednesday, being Bartholomew Day, we marched forth. Some of our soldiers went to the cathedral about 9 or 10 of the clock, in the midst of the superstitious worship, with the singing men and boys. They went about the work they came for. First they removed the table to its place appointed, and then took the seat which it stood upon, and brake that all to pieces. They plucked down the rails and left them for the poor to kindle the fires, and so left the organs to be plucked down when we came back again. But it appeared before we came back they took them down themselves. Post-restoration, the relative lack of damage was noted. In particular, the monuments of the dead were not defaced, although one John Wilde was accused of taking down and selling iron and brass from some tombs. Lord Fairfax's troops stabled the horses in the choir as in other cathedrals. Although no structural damage seems to have occurred, several saw pits were dug in the nave floor. Shortly after the restoration, Samuel Pepys visited Rochester Cathedral on his way between the London and Chatham dockyard. The cathedral had fallen into disrepair during the Commonwealth, and Pepys observed it was now fitting for use, and the organ then a tuning. By 1662 £8,000 had been spent and a further £5,000 of repairs were outstanding. The joint diocesan registrar to the bishops from 1629 until 1671 was Peter Stowell. Under the Commonwealth his loyalty had cost him both fines and his liberty. He spent his own money recovering various books and fittings, as well as spending £100 on flooring the church from the west door to the pulpitum. The Dean of Rochester led prayers in memory of French Vice-Admiral Jean-Claude de la Robinière, who was killed in enemy action by the Spanish-Dutch Navy in 1667. In 1770 Archdeacon John Warner oversaw the removal of seats from the chancels with communion tables set up and railed, as formerly, and notably early re-adoption of the railed altar. The cathedral fabric required continuous care. In 1664 the south aisle was recased, and in 1670 40 feet of the north aisle had to be rebuilt. In 1679 the spire was in a dangerous state on an architect, Samuel Guy, reported on it. He reported that £1,000 of work was needed. However, a few months later a Westminster carpenter, Henry Fry, took a different view. Some lead work and the repair of one beam was sufficient. £160 was spent on the organ. In 1705 work started to relieve the roof, completed by 1724. In 1730 the old ringer's loft above the choir steps was removed and the crossing vaulted. Between 1742 and 1743 major work was undertaken in the choir, sufficiently disruptive that the dean and chapter used nearby St. Nicholas Church. In 1749 the steeple had to be rebuilt, and between 1765 and 1772 the west front towers were rebuilt. The cathedral's south choir aisle and transept were giving cause for concern, so in 1751 they were buttressed, the roof lightened and supporting brickwork placed in the crypt. In 1798 Edward Hasted wrote a description of the cathedral and its environs, published as part of his The History and Topographical Survey of the County of Kent. He observed that time has so far impaired the strength of the materials with which it is built, that in all likelihood the care and attention of the present chapter towards the support of it will not be sufficient to prevent the fall of a great part of it at no great distance of time. A new organ in 1791 completed the 18th century works. 19th century onwards. From 1825 to 1830 Lewis Nockels Cottingham served as diocesan architect. The choir and its south transept were re-roofed due to dry rot. The wall between the main transept and the south choir aisle was still leaning, and the previous century's work had actually worsened the situation. Cottingham built a new external face which effectively buttressed the original wall. The tower was demolished and rebuilt without a spire. The east end was remodeled by lowering the altar and removing the old altar screen. Various windows and arches were opened up, and in one of them the tomb of Bishop John de Sheppey was discovered. Cottingham remained in charge for the next phase of restoration. From 1840 the pulpit and bishop's throne were rebuilt. The removal of the old pulpit revealed the medieval Wheel of Life painting to be seen at the eastern end of the choir stalls today. It is said to be the oldest such painting in England. A new ceiling of the crossing, new canopy for John de Sheppey, cleaning, whitewash and the renovation of the crypt all occurred at this time. From 1871 to 1877 the work was entrusted to Sir George Gilbert Scott. The first phase of the work was to repair the clerestory of the nave. The nave could then be used for service whilst the choir and transepts were worked upon. The south transept was underpinned and the timber vaulting renovated. The north transept had new western windows and a new door. Both had the masonry renovated. The gables and roofs were restored to their old high-pitch form based on prints. The organ screen was restored to its original plain form, perhaps a mistake since there was now no screen on the other side of the pulpit as there had been in the days of St. Nicholas' altar. The east end gables were raised, but due to lack of funds the roof has still not been raised to match. The east window was replaced with the present lancets. The floor of the presbytery was lowered and the whole eastern part of the building refloored. The choir and prebend stalls were renovated, using original material where possible. The work uncovered the original lion and fleur-de-lis heraldic artwork on which Scott based his decoration of the choir. In memory of Dean Scott, the choir screen was decorated with the current statues by J. Loughborough Pearson. Pearson also superintended the 1888 restoration of the west front, parts of the facing of which were separating from the core. The flanking towers were restored to the original height and form, and the north gable turret rendered as a copy of its partner to the south. During this work the ancient foundations of the original church were uncovered and marked out as noted above. In 1904 the present spire was raised upon the Scott Tower, creating the skyline as it is today. During 1998 the precinct beyond the Great West Door was being repaved when further Saxon foundations were uncovered. The coloured sets extend to define the outline. For the 1400th anniversary of the cathedral in 2004, a new fresco was painted by Russian icon painter Sergei Fyodorov.